In this portion of the course, we're looking at the relationship between religion and morality, and we're looking at C. Stephen Layman's view on this topic. And Layman has two tasks that he wants to accomplish with his paper. The first is to contrast the secular and the religious perspectives on morality. And here, when we say secular and religious, roughly we mean atheistic for secular and theistic for religious, that is, thinking of the existence of God or God not existing, and how that might relate to morality. And second, and this would be his more philosophical, more important task, he argues that the moral life makes sense from the theistic point of view much more than it does from a secular point of view. So the primary goal is to show that the most significant secular defenses of morality fail. So regarding the first task of contrasting the secular versus the, I'll call it theistic view, we can construct a table. And so on the left hand, we have the non-theistic or the secular morality, and on the right hand, we have theistic morality. And one difference off the bat is that there is no afterlife for a non-theistic morality where there is for a theistic morality. And a consequence of that for a secular morality is that the only goods available to a person are what we might call earthly goods. So earthly goods can be very honorable and worthy of pursuit: health, friendship, pleasure, knowledge, an adequate standard of living. All of these are earthly goods that could be available even if God does not exist. And on the theistic morality, there is an afterlife. So in addition to those goods, which of course are still there on this worldview, there are goods available after death. For example, joy in the afterlife. Another difference between the two approaches to morality is on the non-theistic side, moral value is an emergent phenomenon, whereas on the theistic morality comes from God's goodness. There is a source of morality, and the source is from the goodness of God. And so thinking about morality as an emergent phenomenon from the non-theistic perspective, the idea here is it's similar to wetness. So wetness doesn't exist with hydrogen or oxygen alone, but when you have H2O forming water, you have something new properties that hydrogen and oxygen alone do not have. And so the idea with morality would be then that there is no morality before there were societies. Societies provide the basis for there to be morality, and it emerges once we have societies. On a theistic morality, since morality comes from God's goodness, moral principles have always been in existence. In other words, morality is not an emergent phenomenon because it's always been there. It does not depend on the existence of societies. And then a final difference to point out is that morality functions to promote common values in a society. That's the purpose of morality on a non-theistic view. And on a theistic view, morality benefits humanity. Certainly, it does have that result, but it did not develop for that function. Instead, it developed from the goodness of God. So those are some contrasts between a theistic morality and a non-theistic morality. Now to the larger philosophical issue, Layman argues that secular morality does not make sense. And this is the second task of Layman. He argues that life makes more sense, the moral life makes more sense from a theistic point of view. And the primary goal here is to show that the most significant secular defense of morality fails, and he actually considers a couple different secular defenses of morality. And one claim here is that secular morality is based on the idea that society cannot function without individuals who are virtuous, who are following moral principles, who are under the moral law, we might even say. Now, Layman's initial criticism of this approach of secular morality is that one might respond to the demands of the morality with this question: why should I care about society? And if an individual didn't care about society, then they would not have a motive to follow moral principles or a motive to be virtuous. So we have this question: why should I care about society on a secular morality? And Layman understands that certainly there is a response to this, and probably multiple responses to this, but the primary response on behalf of secular morality is that individuals cannot flourish without a well-functioning society. So we need morality in order for society to function well. And so because of that, he appeals to something that Socrates said, that, well, why would I selfishly want to live in a bad society? If I'm selfishly motivated, I would still want to live in a good society. And if society can't flourish without a well-functioning, without morality, then I ought to follow the dictates of morality, right? That's the motive here for being moral on a secular morality. Now, Layman has three criticisms of this idea, and in fact, we will even mention a fourth criticism that he has. Okay, so first of all, it's misguided to defend morality by appealing to self-interest. So this is one of his primary criticisms of the defense of morality from a secular point of view. If you're saying that, look, on your own self-interest, it's better for you to live in a well-functioning society, so therefore it's better for you to follow moral principles or to be virtuous, that seems to undermine what morality is all about. In other words, it makes morality a lot more like etiquette. So let's follow through on this analogy to make sure that we understand the point. Layman is arguing that on this view of morality, this kind of selfishly motivated view that it's better for you as an individual to follow moral principles so that society will function well, it's a lot like the force of etiquette. And so why would anyone follow the rules of etiquette? Well, primarily, we do it for the instrumental value it has. So, for example, as we continue to explore this question of why be moral, if you continue to violate principles of etiquette, if you do this often, you're going to be shunned by people. So if you never say please or thank you or open a door for someone, if you're rude and you butt in lines, and if you don't use utensils when you're dining at a restaurant, people don't want to be around you. If you belch loudly and never say excuse me, these kinds of violations of etiquette, you're going to be shunned by others and you're jeopardizing your own best interests. So it seems like we have a kind of selfish motive to follow principles of etiquette so that we will be accepted by others, so that we will be integrated into society, and we don't want to be shunned. So following etiquette, principles of etiquette, pays off for the individual, and that seems to be the motive then on a secular morality, that morality pays off for the individual. It pays to be moral. But Layman argues that this does not make sense. It doesn't make sense to justify morality in this way. And here's why. Why would selfishness be morally bad? And it's broadly considered that selfishness is morally bad. If the entire institution of morality were based on self-interest. So Layman says this doesn't make sense. The dictates of morality say that you should not be selfish, and yet the whole institution of morality on this secular defense is based on a selfish motive. So that is a primary criticism of secular morality. Now, I said 3, maybe 4. The fourth one, we'll see how it relates back to that first one. Okay, second criticism of a secular response is that the secular rationale only works if it is in fact advantageous for the individual to comply with moral principles. So we need to ask this question. Is it really like principles of etiquette? Is it to your advantage to follow moral principles? And Layman says, well, wait a minute. Following moral principles often does not pay for an individual. This often does not work out well. So if the entire motive for being moral is that it's ultimately good for you because it's going to help the society that you are in function well, well, wait a minute. Sometimes following moral principles doesn't pay for the individual. Being moral will sometimes result in a loss of earthly goods. One quick example, suppose you have the opportunity to steal something. Somebody left something behind of value, an iPhone or something, a purse with cash in it, something like that. And you have the opportunity to steal it, to just take it, not tell anyone, and no one will ever know that you did it, and you can get away with it. Well, morality says you shouldn't do that. So morality will cause you to lose that opportunity, so to speak, to gain. And in some cases, morality demands that one risk a lot, not only refrain from gaining, but to risk a lot. Sometimes morality dictates that we should risk even death, but that doesn't make sense from a secular perspective. So what is he talking about here? Well, I just have 3 names up here. For example, Mother Teresa, who on moral motives, of course, she was obviously theist, believing in God, but she was motivated to give up her life, so to speak, for orphans in Calcutta. She lived in poverty her entire life in order to help children. Pat Tillman, you may have heard about. He was a very successful athlete, a cornerback for the Arizona Cardinals in the NFL. And after 9/11, he felt that it wasn't fair that he was living this very wealthy, successful life while other people his age were in Iraq and Afghanistan suffering. And so he quit before, kind of at his pinnacle of the career, at a very young age, when he had a long career ahead of him. He's quit, dropped out, joined the Army, became a Ranger, and ultimately he died in service for our military. Or MLK Jr., who, of course, I trust all of you have much more knowledge of, who was willing to risk his own reputation and ultimately his life for a cause that he believed was greater than he. So all of these people were doing what they felt they were compelled to do based on moral principles, and yet in each case it cost them their life. For Tillman and MLK, very literally before their time. For Mother Teresa, more figuratively, in the sense of she never had the resources that most people do in Western society. Another criticism of the idea of a secular morality, when we have this motivation to help society function well, and so that should be the motive behind our being moral, is Layman argues that the secular view can only justify a tribal morality. So let's be clear what he means by this. A tribal morality is that the rules only apply to those within your social group. So that could be fairly small. It could be a family, or what we might call a clan, extended family. It might be your social group of friends. It could be, your whatever social group you're involved in, or it could be your country, as large as, the United States, or other units of social groups. But moral concerns are typically extended beyond that. So the idea is a secular morality is that you want to be moral in order for the society that you're in to function well. Well, that gives you motive to help the limited society that you're in, but that gives you no motive whatsoever to be moral toward outsiders. So why should somebody in the US care at all about how people are treated in other countries, for example? Or why should you care how other people outside your family, maybe even if you limit this morality to that small of a group, why would you care how those people are treated? So morality might be necessary for society, but if it is, you really only need a tribal morality, a very limited morality where you don't really care what happens to people outside your society. Now, here's another concern that Layman raises. It seems like there could be secret violations of moral rules, right? It seems like, if it's morally wrong to steal, as I suggested earlier, you might be in a situation where you could steal something and get away with it, but it would still be morally wrong, it seems. So what about this? What should we say about this? Wouldn't it be advantageous to do what was not moral for your personal gain if no one knew what you were doing? In fact, right, he has a different example here. Suppose a bank mistakenly believes you already repaid a loan. Maybe you have a car loan at a bank, and let's say you're physically going in to pay your monthly amount due, and they say, and you have 3 years left to pay, and they say, oh yeah, well, sorry, that you don't need to pay, that was closed off, you paid it all off last month. Now you know they're wrong, but somehow they made a mistake, and that's what they say. Wouldn't it be to your advantage? Obviously it would, to just do nothing, to say nothing, to go on your way. But on the other hand, doesn't morality say that you should be honest and let the bank know that they've made a mistake? Or you could do this on a smaller scale. A clerk mistakenly gives you a $10 bill in change when they thought it was a 1, something like that. Do you tell the person or not? Well, the point is not that theists, okay, so Layman wants to make clear, he's not saying that there's this big difference between the moral life of a theist and an atheist, okay? He's not saying that theists never cheat or lie, whereas those with a secular morality do this all the time. But what his point is that secret violations of morality could pay off from a secular perspective, right? So why be moral? Why not try to game the system constantly to your advantage if the whole basis of morality is to act what is in your advantage? Of course, on the flip side, that a theistic morality would make it clear why you would not want to do that. Now, some people could be, and in fact there are some people who are what Layman calls moral freeloaders. The idea here is they maintain an appearance of decency, but in fact are immoral. Maybe they're manipulative. They take advantage of others. We unfortunately see people in the public spotlight who are like this occasionally, politicians or those who gain power in some way, and they appear to be good, decent people, but in fact, they're very manipulative, they're having affairs, they're taking advantage of others. And what Layman is saying is, if there are many of those who are never found out, right? So selfishly, why not act like that if the whole basis of morality is a selfish one? So to sum up, morality and being moral doesn't make sense from a secular perspective. Now, There is one other response from the secular point of view, is that maybe from an evolutionary perspective, morality helps the species survive. So this is a different rationale, right? This is not the selfish rationale that it's good for you to follow morals so that you live in a well-functioning society. This is something different. It says, okay, just by evolution, humans have developed morality as a way to help the species survive. And this is a very common view of morality. Layman says it's problematic for two different reasons. First of all, even if morality helps the species survive, which it seems like that would be true, but why would that be good for the individual? Why, again, where's the motive for an individual to be moral? So from an evolutionary perspective, the individual would care more about their own genes being passed along. So for example, there was a case, and I've heard of a second one more recently, but there was one several years ago that I've heard of, where there was a fertility specialist, a physician who was a gynecologist. And so he would often use sperm donations, or at least that's what he said he was doing, to help women become pregnant. But he was found to be using his own sperm. And so there were at least 30 women who had children that were his biological children because he was using his own sperm. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, wouldn't this be a great thing to do, right? This propagates his genes, he gets other people to take care of his kids, and his genetic line continues on. This person would seemingly be a hero of sorts from this perspective of morality. But Layman says there's another concern with this evolutionary defense of morality, and this is a more deeper philosophical issue. So more importantly, the evolutionary defense may explain why it's good for people to feel as if they were obligated to do or not do certain things. So that would explain that. But it can't explain there actually being an obligation, right? It can't explain there actually being moral principles that we ought to follow. So let's think about this difference, right? It's very different to feel as if you're obligated to do something and there actually being an obligation to do something. So there's a big difference between feeling or believing that you're obligated to, say, write a paper. So imagine a friend in a class tells you, oh, you know, we have a 15-page paper due next week. And you feel like you're obligated to do that. So you ask your friend the more details, and they're pulling a joke on you, and they give you more details, and you feel like you're obligated to do this paper, when in fact, there was no paper due. That was not part of the course assignments, and you don't have the obligation whatsoever. That's a big difference, right? It's a big difference between feeling or believing you're obligated and there actually being an obligation. So Layman is saying, look, evolutionary theory gives some basis for us to feel like we might be morally obligated, but it does not give us an actual obligation to be moral. So when it comes to evaluating the two, Layman asks which is more reasonable, and he says that the problem for secular morality is there is no plausible source of moral principles. We considered kind of a selfish motive, and we considered an evolutionary motive, and he said both of these do not make sense. However, he says on the flip side, morality makes good sense from a theistic view. It's very odd from a secular view. So why does it make good sense from a theistic view? A theistic view explains why we have obligations. It explains why a tribal morality is inadequate, right? Because God wants all people in his kingdom, because God cares about all people, regardless of whether they're in your tribe or in your country or not. And so God wants us to act morally toward all people beyond our society. So Layman says a theistic morality has that advantage. A second advantage is that a theistic morality explains how there can be secret violations of morality, which doesn't make sense on a secular view. But of course, if you're stealing something and get away with it and God exists, then God knows what you're doing. And so you're still violating morality. And then finally, a theistic view explains why there is often a lack of personal fulfillment in this life. Unfortunately, that is all too common. But Layman's idea is that God allows complete fulfillment in the afterlife for those who follow him and seek him. And so even if a person may be moral and pursuing what they believe is a fulfilling life, they are often deceived or end up, like unfortunate recent celebrity suicides have shown, being very dissatisfied with life. And Layman argues that, well, that kind of makes sense because the earthly goods are not what life is all about.